Are we live?
Hello, everybody. We are back. I'm so sorry about that. I don't exactly know what happened. We do appear to have audio back. It dropped off for a reason. I have no idea why. Anyway, Sandra, please, let's do this justice. Let's do Richard justice. Can you reintroduce him, explain who he is and why you have him on today?
Excellent. Thank you so much. So about 18 months ago, I met Richard. He was one of these characters that I've seen him on LinkedIn a number of times. He talks phenomenally brilliant stuff around behavioural science. I was writing an academic paper and someone said, you've got to meet Richard because you're going to get so many more ideas, but make sure you take an empty notebook. And sure enough, I spent an hour and a half, and that actually wasn't enough, with Richard. So Richard works in behavioural science. He's got some amazing news he's got something happening in February. He's the go-to guy for behavioural science as far as I'm concerned, and we're delighted to have him here and also on the Applied Customer Experience course. So let me hand over to you, Richard, to explain what you do and why you do it and this big announcement for February.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and lovely to be here. Thank you for that lovely intro. So I'm Richard Chataway. I'm a Vice President at BVA Nudge Unit. And as the name kind of implies, what we are is specialise in nudging or creating interventions to change behaviour using best practice in behavioural science. And I guess the exciting announcement, certainly exciting for me personally, is that I have a book coming out in February called The Behaviour Business, which is all about applying behavioural science in business. And I guess my experience in doing that in both public and private sectors here in the UK and in Australia. But also, for the book, I went out and interviewed 25 experts from around the world who've been applying behavioural science, a lot of it in customer experience, and gathered insights from them to inform the kind of practical guide was what I was aiming to write. So rather than being simply a guide to the science and taking you through some of the principles of that and what we can talk through today, it also gives people in business advice on how to apply this to deliver business success.
And that's the amazing thing, isn't it, right? So I meet so many customer experience professionals who, when I talk to them about peak end rule or other brilliant stuff we'll talk about in just a second, some of them are aware of it, but very few of them are actually practicing it. Why is that such a surprise? Why are people not grasping this stuff and running with it?
It's a very good question. Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things. I think which I sort of address in the book. One is that that word science. I think people have an inherent bias against science to a certain extent. I've come from the kind of media and advertising world where creativity is prized. And for good reason. One of the beauties of behavioural science is it shows that creativity works. But people have this natural aversion to science and feel that science and creativity are in opposition, whereas actually the opposite is true. That science allows us to unlock creativity and give us a foundation and a base for us to come up with creative ideas. So I think there's that aspect. And I think that aspect, which is a very interesting one, is around the essence of science is based on experimentation and based on the scientific method and testing and learning. And that's something that I think certain industries and certain businesses embrace more than others. Whereas, because obviously some of the things that you find out, or one of the key things you find out about experimenting is that often you're wrong about things. And one of the beauties of behavioural science is that, it gives us counterintuitive solutions to problems. And people don't like to be proved wrong a lot of the time. So you have to embrace the failure and embrace the learning that you make from those mistakes and the evidence base that it gives you in order to drive innovation and drive success. And I think those are things that are as much mindset challenges as they are practical challenges.
It's fascinating though, isn't it? Because I think about the amount of information we're getting, the number of news articles about neuroscience, people's fascination with the brain, more and more evidence coming in particularly from the States, a bit from Britain, around kind of ripping apart some of the traditional views on people and their behavior and consumers. So it feels like now is the right time. I mean, one of my first ever jobs is working in a science centre, so I wouldn't call myself a geek, but I certainly would say that
nothing wrong with being a geek.
Absolutely nothing wrong, Sandra.
but I think perhaps now is the right time for science to be on the agenda because we've got agile working. That's all about experimentation, right? So
yes,
so
absolutely.
Is that one of the reasons why you've written the book now rather than previously or waiting around?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think it's the combination of, you know, the evidence base that we now have around some of these more hidden subconscious drivers of behavior, which is the essence of what behavioral science is all about. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that, you know, the last 50 years, we've learned more about how and why people behave as they do than we did in the previous 5,000 years. Psychology as a discipline really is only about 100 years old. So we're talking about the evolution and the evidence base and the development of the science. That's still fairly new. So yes, absolutely. That's one reason why I think now is the right time. But also, you know, that alignment with ways of thinking, like you say, lean, agile processes. You know, one of the things I talk about again in the book is about that was really inspirational to me was learning about the approach that startups take in terms of minimum viable product and the MVP approach, and basically saying, you know, the most important thing is to get to market as quickly as possible with a product, with a proposition, and then test and learn and iterate based on that. So you build something that's the you know, the most basic version of what you can do, but then you build from that, and, you know, through in the app world, for example, you can produce updates that allow you to then improve and optimize. And I think that's a really interesting insight, and something that, you know, I think in particularly in the customer experience world that we can learn a lot from.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think there's definitely something around marketeers and customer experience professionals and insight, you know, R&D guys, taking the courage of testing some of the models, some of the science that's out there, which we'll go on to in just a second. But actually, I really believe in my heart that a lot of customer experience people particularly would save themselves so much time if they were able just to say, do you know what, here's a theory and it's been proven, and knock your socks off, you know, showing it at board level and being able to prove, because here's the evidence, right? Here's the evidence.
Yeah.
That's one of the things in CX is that we don't have as much, I might perceive, I'm sure there's going to be someone who disagree.
If you disagree with Sandra, please put a comment in here.
I think having the backup of science is hugely helpful, because I think, you know, particularly engineering brains, they really want to see this stuff. So yes. I don't know if there's a question in there. I think that the point is just reinforcing what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think absolutely, obviously, I completely agree. And I think, you know, one of the opening line of my book is, if you're in business, you're in the business of behavior. And the thing is, if, you know, because we have this new science and new evidence base around what drives behavior, if you're not using that in customer experience or any other aspect of your business, then you're not using that evidence base, and you're not taking a very scientific approach. And I think, you know, as you say, particularly people who value that approach, engineers or whatever, in whatever role they're in business, then that's really the, you know, all you need to know, to be honest, to a certain extent. And then obviously then it's about working with people who have that understanding of science, and that's why I went out and spoke to the experts I did for my book about how to apply it in different contexts. And so, you know, the book covers customer experience, but it also covers AI and automation and the issues around that in customer experience in particular. We also talk about marketing, we talk about customer insight, and talk about recruitment and assessment. And all of those things are areas of business which are A, hugely important, but B, can be very positively impacted, often at relatively low cost, the application of behavioural science, the understanding of some of these principles. And you know, that's really was the inspiration for me to write the book, was, you know, not only from my own work demonstrating that, but also just recognizing that there was so much opportunity for businesses to learn from it that isn't being applied.
So you've already, I'm going to have this recorded. You have promised me a signed copy when it comes out.
Yeah, of course. So
let me ask you a slightly different question, because I have some theories in my back pocket of my favourites. But of all the behavioural science out there, what are your top two? Which ones are the gold medalists out there that people don't know about?
Yeah. Well, one of my personal favourites, which I think is fundamental, really, in lots of aspects of life. So I think it's something that's really changed my working life, has been really important, but also I think in terms of the way I view the world, is the fundamental attribution error. So this is a behavioural bias, if you like, or a principle, which is that we tend to underestimate the importance of context on people's behaviour, and we overestimate kind of intrinsic aspects, particularly personality of people in terms of their behaviour. So to give you an example, imagine you're interviewing someone for a job, or in the customer experience world, you're talking to a customer on the phone, and the first thing the customer is shouting at you down the phone, because they have some perceived slight or they're perceived in a perception that they're not receiving the best possible customer experience. Now, our natural reaction to that is to think that that person is a naturally aggressive person, is someone who is irate, generally, maybe prone to road rage or any number of other behaviours that we would associate with people with anger management issues. But the reality of the situation is that it's more likely that there's something that's happened, some context, possibly that day, they might have received some bad news, or it is some failure in the quality of the customer experience they've received that's driving that behaviour. It's not that they are an innately angry person or the kind of person who likes to complain. There are some people who are like that, undoubtedly, but in the majority of cases, and actually more than we estimate, when people are behaving like that, it's to do with something has gone wrong, some contextual factor. Yeah. And so, if you're in the customer experience world, it's worth remembering that obviously, if customers are angry about something, then it is because of some of that. It's most likely going to be one of those contextual factors. You can't just write it off as this is an angry person. And in the same way, let's say if you're interviewing someone for a job, they arrive late for the interview. Our natural instinct is to assume that they're going to be late every day and they may be unreliable, and therefore it's going to impact on our likelihood of hiring them in that role. The reality of the matter is any number of things could have caused them to be late on that one day. They may never have been late in the rest of their life. It's not representative of that particular instance. And so the fundamental attribution error, basically what it's taught me is to remember that other things are going on in people's lives on a daily basis that we are not aware of and we're not conscious of. And you should always assume, the default should be to assume it's probably something like that that's driving their behaviour rather than they are someone who is always late.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because I know many organisations categorise customers in a particular way, which is at best simplistic, at worst detrimental to the long-term relationship. So I think that your point, maybe we need to funk up some of these terms, because fundamental attribution errors, crikey, I think my English shorthand. Yeah. The point is that, I know that some organisations have trained their frontline staff to be more empathetic, and to ask particular types of questions to try and uncover, really just to get to the bottom of what's really driving that behaviour. They're not angry at overall, which is what you just said. They've had this thing that's happened, and through using the skills of empathy, it then brings that person down to a more normal, whatever that is, state.
Yes.
And there's something interesting there as well around, and you'll know this far better than I do, but the stuff that Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about in, how emotions are made. And how many customer experience professionals talk about, here are the X number of emotions that we are going to try and get out of our customers, and these are the emotions that people show up. The fact is, as you know better than I do, emotions are a DNA. They're like a fingerprint.
Absolutely.
To your point, depending on the experience they've had, depending on their socialization, depending on their expectation, it's going to be totally unique, whatever shows up. So I think your point about context is really, really key. And I do hope anyone listening to this and also watching the recording will consider that, because I think it's a real tough one to persuade others that actually just got to deal with it in the moment. You've got to be spontaneous. So having all these policies and procedures to deal with a unhappy person, a angry person, just doesn't work. So your second favourite, Richard, what have you got?
So before you move on, I'm just going to jump in because I'm just here to kind of oversee things and make sure it all runs smoothly. I do want to make sure that anyone that's watching gets an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. Please do. We got a load last week and it was really good to have that interaction with the people that are watching. We've got people there now. So if you've got a question for Sandra or for Richard or for me even, although I don't know what I can possibly add to this conversation right now. Please do leave the comment below, and I will make sure that I interject and get them to answer them.
Brilliant, thank you.
Carry on, Richard. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. Yeah, I'd love to answer any questions anyone has. I think the other thing that's really fundamental to me, and I think been particularly important in my work, has been focused on communications for most of my career, and particularly when we're thinking about customer experience and how we communicate to customers, is that one thing that behavioural science tells us is that simply giving people information and telling people things is not sufficient to change behaviour. It's as much about how you say something as what you are saying. So to give you an example, we worked with a major bank here in the UK with their customer service representatives, and we were looking at ways in which we could encourage customers to no longer transact via cheque, because actually, from a customer viewpoint, it's a very bad experience receiving a cheque in the post. What that then means is they've got to go to their branch, assuming they still have a branch locally. Obviously, a lot of the banks are closing branches now, and then they will have to wait up to 7 days to actually receive the money in their account. It's much more beneficial for the customer to receive the money paid directly into their account. It's also, to be honest, a lot more secure than sending out a cheque in the post. It also uses less paper, so it's better for the environment. So we often talk in our work at a BVA Nudge Unit about win-win-win scenarios, which is basically where it's a win for your target audience, be that the customer or be that employees. It's a win for the organisation, and it's also a win for society as well. And obviously, the less paper we use, the better that is in environmental terms. And so in this particular case, what we were trying to do was to nudge people into moving from receiving a cheque in the post to receiving money direct into their account. And the way that the customer service representatives would talk about this made a lot of sense. They basically say to customers exactly pretty much what I just said. They'd say, look, if you want to, we notice you still receive money by cheque. Why don't you get it changed, paid direct into your account so that you can receive the money faster, it uses less paper, and it's more secure. And customers were just like, no, I'm not interested. I'm doing what I'm doing. One of the things behavioural science tells us is that people are what we call cognitive misers. We're essentially lazy in the way we think. We're very happy to go with our habits and our existing system one instinctive behaviours a lot of the time. And we're very driven by inertia, basically. And so customers in that context, particularly as bearing in mind they probably called up about something completely different, were very happy just to carry on doing what they were doing. So what we did was we piloted a new version of the script where what the customer service representatives said was, we can make this change for you, so you no longer receive money by cheque. If you like, I can change this, which is a very subtle change. It's basically a win for the customer, no effort on your part, customer. I will do the work for you. If you like, I can do that now, so you don't miss out. Now, the concept of missing out, we're all familiar with probably with the concept of fear of missing out, FOMO, is a very important one in behavioural science. It's what we call loss aversion. So people are very motivated by loss more so than they are by gains. It's going back to your point about emotions, Sandra. We feel the strength of the emotional reaction we have to losing £20 stronger than the emotional reaction we have to gaining £20. So that with that fear of loss is a big driver of human behaviour. And just by reframing the conversation in that way, it had a massive impact on the number of people who actually made that change. And that's an example of, as I say, how you say something is important to what you're saying, because the information is the same. Of course, if customers then, because we noticed we didn't say what you're missing out on, we just said there's a potential to miss out on. If customers queried that, then obviously the customer service representative would say, oh, well, it's better for the environment, it's going to be, you get your money quicker, etc., etc. But we didn't even have to give them those reasons. There was people knew it was probably better, but they just was so fearful of making any kind of change and changing their habits that they couldn't do it without that little nudge from us to do.
It's interesting, isn't it? You talk of fear of missing out. I remember when I was quite little going to Wembley Market. Those are the days, right? Long time ago. And there'd be this guy on the back of a truck, and there'd be thousands, not thousands, I was only little, hundreds of people in front, and he'd have this great big crockery set, and he'd say, I've only got one left. And my mum was like, I've got to have that. And I'm like, we've already got it.
Right, here's the rub.
He sells it, and then he's like, oh, just found another one. I'll never forget that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, it's absolutely, that scarcity principle is very motivating.
Yeah.
Every time you go onto a hotel website or an airline website, only 4 seats left at this price. That's what.
Amazon do it. Amazon are famous for doing it across their whole website, but particularly on Black Friday. That ability to create scarcity enables them to sell more.
That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amazon, again, they use lots of behavioral nudges in the way that they sell. One of the ones I'm sure you'll both be familiar with, and our viewers will be familiar with, is the recommendation engine. So, other people have bought these products, or bought this, have also bought this. And I mentioned this as an example in my book. They don't release the data on this, Amazon, but the rumor is it's worth about 30% of their total revenue is driven by that recommendation.
By the recommendation engine.
Yeah. By simply when people have made a purchase, saying other people also bought this, or items similar to them.
Do you read? I mean, it's a really good example, and actually, for those, because there will be some people that are watching from my network that won't know some of the terminology that you and Sandra talk about daily. So behavioural nudges, it wasn't a term that I was particularly aware of, but actually, that's a really good example, because we've all used or benefited in some way, perhaps, from that particular example of a behavioural nudge, that recommendation on Amazon, or that recommendation on the website that we're looking to buy from. But that's hotels, on Trivago, wherever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the contention, or if you like, that I make in the book, is that when you look at the most successful digital companies for the 21st century, so you look at the FANGs, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, their success is as much, if not more so, driven by their understanding of human behavior and how to nudge those behaviors than it is by technology. I mean, I remember when Google launched, 21 years ago now, and it wasn't the first search engine. If you remember, we used to have Ask Jeeves, we had
Ask Jeeves. That was when I was younger, that was the revolution, because you could ask it anything and it came up with something.
Absolutely.
And at the time, no one would have thought that would ever be bettered.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing about Ask Jeeves was that, if you remember, you had to type in a question.
Yes.
And you had to frame it as a question with a question mark at the end.
Yes, you did.
And from a user experience viewpoint, from a customer experience viewpoint, that's not cognitively easy. That's not something that requires additional thought. Going back to this point about us being cognitive minded, in the book Nudge, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have this brilliant analogy to say that the kind of perception, or the traditional viewpoint of how humans make decisions, is very much like Spock from Star Trek. It's very rational. We're very, we weigh up the pros and cons of every decision we make, and we choose it based on the pros being better than the cons, or vice versa. But actually, the reality is we're much more like Homer Simpson, driven by our desire for donuts, or we have all these subconscious things that are going on in our brain that influence our behavior, and we are cognitively lazy. The reason why it's a great analogy is Homer is one of the laziest people in popular culture, and so and that's a great example of that. The effort required to type in a question on Ask Jeeves is too much for people, whereas on Google it's a very simple interface. You've got the two boxes, Google search and I'm feeling lucky, and you just put in what you can put in one word, depending on what you're searching for, and instantly bring up your results.
Ernesto's just jumped in on the comment. Sorry, just to jump back on what we were saying just now. Amazon send notification items when items in your cart change prices, or when they go in and out of stock. He said another form of FOMO. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Now, to explain why the postman is so busy at my house, can we just go to the Kahneman slide?
Absolutely. I've got it on the screen now.
I just want to explore this in a little bit more detail, because I find it frustrating. That's the truth. I find it really frustrating when organizations measure their success by things like Net Promoter Score, and they forget about effort. So we know from Kahneman this whole point around system 1 and system 2 thinking. We know that system 1 is based on a whole bunch of assumptions and our experience, and we don't always get it right. But system 2, when you make me work hard, is I can just feel my brain overheating, and I just think I'm either going to go with this because I love this brand so much, or you're binned and I'm going somewhere else. So if we can just talk for a minute around things like customer effort scores and things that give people a much better understanding that if you don't make it easy, you may as well get your coat, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why do people not home in on this stuff? I mean, it's beautiful, but we don't look at it enough. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, a really good point, and I guess, you know, one of the reasons one of the things I want to explore in the book. I think, you know, there are often kind of operational, functional reasons why it happens in businesses. You know, I've done a lot of work in financial services, regulation and compliance, and so we kind of, you know, drive a lot of the processes and systems. A lot of the, you know, if we're talking about that example I mentioned about with scripting for a savings bank. You know, their scripts had been largely written by, and this happens quite regularly, had been largely written with a view to compliance first and foremost. You know, so in some cases the scripts will have been written by a legal team, and so obviously, you know, their biases and what their requirements are is that they're not looking at things with a customer-centric lens. Obviously, they're mainly looking to avoid risk. Again, going back to the loss aversion point in the decision making. Is a lot of business decision making happens. People focus on loss and focus on potential risk. Whereas, you know, and this is one of the most relevant aspects around this understanding of people wanting things to be made easy for them, and wanting to, you know, the importance of system one behaviors is that because these changes are often quite small. As in the example I gave you, you know, it was a very small scripting change. Substantively, the information we conveyed didn't change. You can often implement them without needing to, without, you know, changing those compliance requirements or falling foul of those compliance requirements. Because, you know, the information, as I say, is substantially the same. You're still providing people with the same choices. It's just the way you present choices to people has a big impact on the choice they actually make. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons is that, you know, that in businesses, because of this drive towards risk aversion, towards you know, not falling foul of regulations, compliance, internal processes, that we focus on that first rather than thinking about actually from a customer viewpoint, how can we make things as easy as possible for them?
Right. So another, and we touched on it just earlier in this conversation, the point around peak end rule. And obviously another piece of work by Kahneman, which is probably one of my favorites, because I think this whole thing around organizations not dealing with recovery is such a missed opportunity.
Yes.
For those guys viewing right now, perhaps you'd be better placed to give a quick summary on what peak end rule is.
I'm assuming you're talking to Richard here.
Give me your best, mate.
So yeah, no, the peak end rule. I mean, as you say, I think peak end rule is one of the findings from behavioural science that's most applicable in customer experience in particular. And the idea behind, or the concept is that what determines our evaluation of an experience, and that could be anything from, you know, we've been working with some visitor attractions, for example, so it could be Disneyland, it could be Harry Potter World, whatever it is, or it could be your experience of reading a book or going to a movie. What determines your reflections and your perception of that quality of that experience is not the quality of the experience as a whole necessarily. We don't, you know, and once we've seen a movie, we don't think back on the full 2 hours of that movie and then come up with an average evaluation over the course of that, because that's just.
I go with a spreadsheet.
Yeah, minute by minute analysis
of
what we've just watched. That's not how humans work. That's not how our brains work. What we do is we form our perception of that experience and the quality of that experience primarily based on two factors that have a disproportionate effect on our quality, on our perception of quality experience. As you say, one is the peak, which is the emotional peak. So if we're watching a horror movie, the scariest bit, we're watching a comedy movie, the funniest bit, etc. And then the end. So the thing, partly because obviously that's the thing that's happens most recently. So it's the thing we'll remember straight away after the experience, but how an experience ends. And so, you know, taking it back to customer experience, obviously, you know, as you say, if you've had a negative, if you are ringing up to complain, or you're seeking, you're making a complaint to an organization, how that is dealt with can create an emotional peak, which will then impact on people's perception of that experience. And if it's dealt with successfully, you could actually end up with creating a much more positive, more loyal customer as a result of that. And then obviously the ending as well. So how you finish the call is very important. And there are opportunities around how you frame the ending of that experience that you know that will then have a hopefully positive impact on how people perceive the experience as a whole.
Yeah.
So that's a really, you know, that's a really important finding, and you know, a relatively, I think, easy one to grasp as well for a lot of organisations, which can fundamentally change how you actually deal with customers and how you frame the customer experience. I mean, I'll give you an example. Again, working with that with the savings bank that I mentioned, one of the things we were trying to do was, or one thing we recognised was actually for certain types of query, people would get a much better resolution going online and going there. And also, obviously, online is generally more convenient for people because you can access it 24 hours a day. And so, but the natural way for most customer service representatives on the phone to end a call is to say, if you have any problems, just call us back. Now, what you're doing there is you're framing that to say, I have another problem. The first thing you do is pick up the phone. And whereas actually, in a lot of cases, as I say, you'd be better off going online. We changed the framing of the ending of the call to say, you know, if you have any more problems, you might find the solution online. But if that doesn't work for you, you can always call us back. We're here 24/7. So you're still saying, look, you know, we're helpful. We will provide the service that you want, but you're reframing that in a way that nudges people into going online first.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. That was very, much more articulate than I would have done. I would have ended stuff. Can we move on to another slide there?
Yeah.
The Stoughton.
Absolutely. It's on the screen now.
I flicked through this book quite some time ago. I haven't read it cover to cover, hands on heart, but I thought it was fascinating because this guy, and you correct me if I'm wrong, this guy has written this publication from a marketing perspective. He has very articulately picked out a number of biases. And on this slide, I've picked out a couple that were my favourite from the stuff that I've read. But any advice out there for people who might be tempted to pick this book up? What might be the golden nugget that you got from this publication?
Oh yeah, no, I mean, Richard's a friend of mine, and we've known each other for a little while now. And in fact, it was him who recommended me to his publisher for my book. So I have a little bit of a vested interest here, if you like. But yeah, I think Richard, you know, the brilliant thing about Richard's book is, as you say, he's taken 25 of these behavioural biases. I mean, one of the challenges, and I think one of the barriers sometimes people have to applying behavioural science, is that the field is growing very fast. There's a lot of great work being done out there, but in terms of these biases or heuristics, as they're referred to, these things, subconscious factors that influence our behaviour. There's been over 200 identified from research. So knowing what to apply and what's relevant in a particular context is quite hard. What's brilliant about Richard's book is he's taken 25 of those, as you say, explained them in a very easily understandable way, and then directly applied them to the world of marketing and advertising, which is the world that he works in and has come from, similar to me actually. And so the beauty of that is that absolutely, as you say, it you know, it demonstrates the value of these and how they can be applied in a practical real world context. The examples that you pulled out there, do you want me to say a word or two about those?
Yeah, that would be great. Again, they're my favourites.
Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah, and actually, you know, I was talking about fundamental attribution error earlier as well. Richard's got a brilliant chapter on that as well. The wishful seeing aspect is a really interesting one. So as it says there, what we perceive is not an objective reflection of the physical world. So the thing to remember about this, and I suppose the key takeout, is that, you know, our perception of reality is framed by these biases and heuristics that we have, and these innate biases that we have as humans. And so, you know, without getting too philosophical about it, the way that you see the world is the way that is different to the way that I see the world and the way that Dominic sees the world. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And I think one thing that the particular relevance that it has for people in customer experience and marketers is that how you think about your brand and how you think about the customer experience is different to how your customers will see it. And so the only way really to understand how they see it and their perceptions of that experience is obviously to find that, to research it and to find that out, and to not only speak to customers, but also to objectively view that experience and objectively view their behavior. I talked about, earlier, one of the fundamental insights for me for behavioral science is that information, simply giving people information, is not enough. How you say something is important as what you say. A really fundamental thing for me, and really important thing, is that what people say they do is often very different to what they actually do in reality. To the extent whereby I've sat in research groups and things, and people have just outright lied. Now they don't, they don't realise that they're lying. You can basically, speak to people on the way into a supermarket and say, do you care about, whether the eggs you buy are free range or not? And they go, oh yes, I do. I'm really welfare is really important to me. I really care about these factors. And then they'll go in and buy and they'll see the battery farm eggs are 20p cheaper, and they'll buy those. And I'm not saying that's because people are dishonest, because they're not. It's just they're not consciously aware of things. Because in a lot of cases, brands are not the most important things that may be happening in their lives on that particular day. So that's the real importance of wishful seeing, is that recognizing that you as someone who works in that world, who works for that brand, you might be spending 7 days a week thinking about that brand and thinking about it very deeply, but your customers aren't. And so that's not to say it's not important, but actually all it emphasizes is really important that you understand what is driving those customer behaviors and understand more deeply, because otherwise you're going to have an unrealistic expectation of how they feel about that brand.
Just building on your point around they don't mean to, but people do tell lies around the whole conscious and less conscious side. I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago now, actually, which kind of blew my mind on this very topic. So while we're very busy surveying people all the time, we're giving them a survey, we're asking them net promoter score, you can tell I've got a bit of a beef going on about that at the moment, various other things, this whole thing around, well, we asked them and they said, but then they behave completely differently. If people really, really looked at that, we would end up using biometrics far more, I think. We'd end up wiring people up so that we could see their heart rate, their temperature, and the physical state, because the physical state doesn't lie. It's this thing here that tells you what you think you need to hear. So I'm kind of expecting, and I don't know what you think about this, a boom in biometrics at some point, because people have enough of spending millions and millions on surveys. They keep basing the decisions of investment on those surveys, and they keep turning out not to be the thing. What's your prediction on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think lots of the research techniques and the technology that we have available now means that use of those kind of technologies is a lot cheaper than it used to be, and a lot easier, and B, it just fundamentally is going to give you a clearer and more accurate picture of what's driving human behavior. So BVA, the company that I work for, have been pioneers in this space to a certain extent, particularly around shopper behavior. So we have shopper labs, which are fake supermarkets. Basically, you open a door in what looks like an ordinary office building, and suddenly you're standing in a supermarket. And what we do is we work with brands, and we mock up shelves and have actual products on the shelves, and then we just ask people to go into the supermarket and behave as they would do normally and shop in that way. And obviously we do speak to them as well, because it is, as you say, it's really important to recognise the difference between what people say and what they do, because that unlocks a lot of interesting insights sometimes when you look at the difference between them, or if they are congruent. That's a really useful insight, because okay, right, this is we've got a solid finding here. If people are saying something and doing it, then it's we're on very solid ground. But the value of getting people into a supermarket, and then what we'll also do is we'll often get them to wear eye tracking glasses, so we can see what they're looking at, where they're looking on the shelf, what's catching their eye, and then we'll also, as you say, we'll often use biometrics as well. So they'll wear a wristband like a Fitbit, and that's monitoring their heart rate. We can see what literally gets their pulses racing, and how they behave accordingly. And as you say, that's always fascinating in terms of how you can then say, okay, well, people told us this thing, but we got them in the real world environment, and we looked at how they behaved, and we looked at how they physiologically responded in terms of what we looked at and what it did to their pulse rate and what they call galvanic skin response. is really fascinating. And
can I jump in and ask a question there? Because I'm really interested to know how that work is then applied back into the supermarket to change the experience that me as a customer or consumer has.
So I guess in the work that we do, we're talking about we often talk about choice architecture, and what we mean by choice architecture is the way you present choices to people and the way you frame choices to people. And because what behavioural science tells us is that the way you present choices to people can be very influential in terms of what choices then made. So a classic example from supermarkets that's been proven through numerous experiments is that if you want people to eat more healthily, then one thing you should do is to put the healthy foods on lower shelves. So you basically make it easier for people to actually grasp those items, and then more likely to put them in their basket. So they're more, you put them at eye level and all this kind of thing. So to answer your question in terms of how that influences what these brands might do is, particularly when we're looking at things like eye tracking, and looking at the glasses, and we're looking at where they're looking at the shelf, we're looking at how the choice architecture is laid out, how those choices are presented to people, what draws their eye and what doesn't draw their eye, if you like, because we know that then has a big impact on what they actually choose as a result. So the way that brands would use that is, for example, to determine which aisle they go in, where people are actually spending more time, where they're actually dwelling, and where they're looking at the shelves more often. If they're going to be looking, if we can get them in an aisle where people will be looking for longer, then they're more likely to make a purchase of that item. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
An example of how that would be used. And then you can also look at things like packaging, obviously, how prominent certain things are on the packaging. One thing, again, behavioural science tells us is that people love novelty. So having a big red star on that says new just attracts people's eye, and that generates an emotional response to it. So we can tell them where that should be placed, how prominent that should be, what colour it should be, that kind of stuff. Okay. And that's the relevance of it and how it then be used.
Okay.
There's also a case study I'm aware of where there's a salesperson and a customer. The customer is wearing the wristband, and in fact, by use of some language that the salesperson used, the individual, the customer's stress levels went through the sky. And actually, the salesperson is completely oblivious. Because the person's facial expression changes a fraction because they're trying to kind of mask what they're really thinking. And what that meant is that when they looked at the reading, they then asked the question, what happened then? And it just turns out that the guy had made an assumption around this guy being able to drive an automatic rather than a gear. And the guy did not want to drive an automatic. And the guy lost the sale as a consequence of that. So it changes the conversation because you can highlight, that didn't work. Because the sales guy didn't realise, and the other guy, apart from, I don't feel comfortable, I don't want to drive it anymore, it just changes the outcome.
Absolutely. How you say something is important as what you say, and how you frame something is going to have a big impact on those stress levels. We had a similar example again with a financial organisation where they were framing the security questions that they asked people, which is obviously very important. Again, going back to my point about compliance, you need to make sure that people aren't fraudulently accessing accounts. But the way they framed it was to say, if you fail the security process, I can't help you, basically. Which, from a customer viewpoint, is a horribly stressful experience, because then the pressure is on you to get your questions right. If you don't get your questions right, then whatever the transaction is, you might be buying a house, you might need to transfer a deposit that day or something like that into your stress levels, which potentially are already quite high. So the simple change we made there was to say, look, don't panic. We actually, weirdly, given that one of our objectives was to shorten the length of the customer interactions, we actually said to customers, slow down, because we know that the more relaxed and the more slowly people the more people slow down that process, the less stressed they are, and stress levels actually have an impact on quality of memory and your ability to retrieve information. When people are stressed, they find it harder to remember things. And so in this particular context, it was really important just to put people at ease and to say, look, if you don't get this process right, don't worry, we've got another process we can take you through to help you get access to your account. And interestingly, both obviously improved the quality of the customer interaction, the customer experience, but also what it did was increase the success rate of people going through security without compromising the security metrics.
I'm just going to jump into the comments, because we had a couple of comments come in then when we were talking about the research and how it's used in supermarkets. Princey Singh says, useful but sounds scary at the same time, which I completely agree. And then follows it up with, I understand how data can be used to change opinions and trigger an urge to buy a product.
Yeah. Can we just go? I'm conscious of time, but can we just go?
I'm very conscious of time, and this is, as you said earlier, this could easily be something we talk all afternoon about, but we don't have all afternoon. So you need to. Where do you want to go next, Sandra?
Let's go to Peter's for a second.
Okay. It's on the screen.
Because this comes back to a point you just made, Richard, around the mind kind of shutting down. From what I've read, particularly of this book, the Chimp Paradox, it was a game changer for me. Really easy read. All of you guys that are listening in and obviously listening to the recording, I give this to my students and they come back to me and just say, I had no idea that there was this thing called the amygdala that is going to hijack this bit of my brain, which means I can't think straight, which comes back to your point around once the fear sets in and the panic, forget it. You're not going to get anything out of people because they're just going to lockdown.
Yeah.
And I think people, particularly in customer experience, understanding the chemistry, the kind of physical, the physicality of what actually happens to customers when you frighten them or you don't give them what they expect, you have to spend so much more time getting them back on side and relaxing and being calm so they can make the right decision, right? Anything to add to that, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's really interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I talk about behavioral science rather than behavioral economics is because, when the learning, or the insight that we can get around what drives human behavior is from a range of different disciplines. So it's not just behavioral economics, it's social psychology, it's business psychology, and it's neuroscience as well, and understanding of what's actually going on in our brains when we make decisions. And so, yeah, exactly as you say, the amygdala is where a lot of those more emotional decisions are made. Those emotional decisions tend to be, or system one decision making tends to be more driven by emotions. And more by these instinctive responses. And so, like you say, once the amygdala has been triggered, for want of a better word, once it takes over, and to a certain extent, we're not an autopilot. We're not zombies, but we do get those fear factors, those emotional drivers will become much more prevalent and become the most important point at that stage. Whereas going back to my earlier point, we think often as organizations that, we provide the information to people, then that will override it. But actually the way you present the information, recognizing that people are in that emotional state. Dan Kelly, who I know you've got mentioned in this further on, he's done a lot of work around what's called emotional hot states and emotional cold states. Yeah. It's very important to that. The example I made with the security process. When people are in an emotionally hot state, they behave less rationally. They just, information is going to be less important to people than satisfying whatever their emotional needs and drivers are at that particular point. Yeah. And relevant to a whole, field of not just customer experience, but also, how we think about why people commit crime and all those kind of things. These are factors that are very important. They are hardwired into our brains, hence, the chimp paradox. We are ultimately just evolved apes. And so, we are, and some of those vestiges of when we were, very primordial beings still exist, and our brains are fundamentally the same. But the world we live in is obviously very different. Yeah. The world's been designed in a very different way.
Could just go on for hours.
You said this would happen.
I know.
I enjoyed it, really enjoying it.
Okay.
So I've just put, and I know, Richard, you referred to one of the books. Actually, I put this slide up on the screen at the time. You referred to one of the books, which is Nudge by Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein. And then there's another one on the screen as well, which is Inside the Nudge Unit by David Halpern. Obviously, books that you both read and recommend.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, David Halpern's book is very much about the way. In fact, both books actually kind of have a public policy focus, I guess, if you like. So Nudge was a book that was really important in terms of raising the awareness and understanding of how behavioral science could help us with a lot of societal problems. The classic example, and one that's impacted on all of our lives, is about saving for retirement. So the change in policy to auto-enrollment pensions was primarily driven directly by that book, by Nudge, and the work Taylor and Sons had done. And that means, I was reading some stats the other day, that now means there's another 3 million people in the UK who are now have pensions for saving for retirement, and the value of that is literally in the billions of pounds. But it was a very small change, obviously, in terms of the actual impact. Or the requirement. And then, inside the Nudge Unit, David Halpern was created what's called the Nudge Unit, which is the UK's behavioural insights team, who working within government, and talking about, I guess, how that's informed their work and how they've applied it. I guess, as I say, going back to my book, my intention was to write something to talk specifically about business and how we can apply these principles in business. And I think, this is one of the things about behavioural science, is that unusually, we tend to think of business leading the way in terms of innovation and best practice, and government falling something slightly behind. Behavioural science is one area where the opposite is true. Governments have kind of been leading the way in terms of nudging us into better behaviours for a number of years now. They've still got a long way to go, don't get me wrong, but there are, ways in which our behaviour is being nudged, and this is where I was first, made aware of these techniques and how effective they are. But businesses are not applying them as systematically and as regularly. So there's huge opportunities for us to do that.
I've put a picture of your book on the screen right now with the caption that Sandra very kindly wrote, out in February. Give it a big push, Richard.
Oh, thank you. I feel like I've plugged it quite already, I guess. But that is hot off the press. The cover was designed, it's only just been released, but yeah, the book is as I say, is about how to practically apply behavioural science in business. So as I say, if you're in business, you're in the business of behaviour. And so the idea behind it is really to look at it in two ways. One is that understanding of actually these more hidden drivers of behaviour, these system one factors, subconscious factors, are more important than we realise. And so, if you're not applying those in business, then actually, you're missing out on a lot of potential benefits. And then the second side of it is the science bit, really, is that, how you can scientifically apply this within business. And by that, it's, going back to the earlier point, it's about testing and learning and iterating around that. And talking about how businesses can do that and do it in a way which is both effective, but also doesn't, break the bank. So the book is in 6 parts. Each part deals with a different aspect and challenge that businesses face. And as I say, I talked to 25 experts from around the world on how they've been applying behavioural science and their insights around behavioural science in order to address these challenges. So it talks about AI and automation. It talks about recruitment and assessment. It talks about customer insight and customer experience, and marketing as well. And I'm sure there's probably one I've forgotten there as well. Those
I'm going to take the guess that this could be applied to any business. This isn't across the board, and it doesn't matter in what industry or sector or what size.
Yes, absolutely. I've worked with, as I say, I've worked in government, I've worked with major multinationals, but I've also worked with startups. And some of the organisations that I've worked with have been relatively small-scale businesses as well. We've been able to apply behavioural science in this context. So the idea is as I say, if you're in business of any type, whether you're a retailer, whether you're an insurance company, whether you're a tech startup, there are opportunities to apply behavioural science, and that's who I'm aiming for. Really, is that if you have an interest in some of the things I've talked about today. And how to get business success, then hopefully the book will be relevant to you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You don't have to wait till February. That's the joy, because Richard's one of the speakers on the Applied Customer Experience course in January.
Wow.
Indeed.
Now, that was a very, very well-timed segue into exactly what you want to push.
Yeah. So Richard will be one of the guest speakers on the course, as will Adrian Swimscoes, the guest on next week's LinkedIn Live. So Adrian is also an author. He does quite a lot in the space of podcasts and public speaking about customer experience. And actually, he doesn't know this, but he will do, that I kind of call him my controversial friend. Because whenever...
Sorry, you call him your what? You cut out very slightly then.
My controversial friend. He produced a book called CX Punk with the deliberate purpose of saying, we're not standing for the standard here. We need to mix it up and be a little bit more, what's the word? Not disruptive, because that word is used too often, but really question, really bring a different angle to all of this and call everyone to account. So he'll be joining us next week. He's also speaking on the Applied Customer Experience course. And I think between Adrian and Richard, the guys that join this course are going to be in for a treat.
Absolutely. So let's just talk about the course. Let's talk about the course very briefly. I've got the next slide up, which is, if you liked this, check out the Applied Customer Experience course, which is 5 days spread over 3 in January 2020 and 2 in March.
Yeah.
Sandra, talk a bit more about it.
So the ambition of this course is to blend not only some of the science that Richard's been talking about, bringing in psychology, bringing in a whole range of different academic models with practical experience. So we've got guys coming in from John Lewis, from Volvo, from Sky, a number of household brands, to tell the guys that join the course, this is how we do it in our organization. This is what I've learned. This is what you can learn from me. So it's that whole blend between here's the knowledge and here's the practical application. It's split into 3 days and 2 days, because what we want to do is give everyone an idea of what's going on in those 3 days, and then a bunch of tasks and a bunch of tools that they can use in the space between January and March, all come back together again in March to find out what worked, what did they learn, what did they learn from one another, plus a bit more learning again. And the joy of it is that you get a certificate at the end, which is endorsed by Business School in London. So hugely exciting. So
I've put the slide on the screen showing what each of the 5 days covers. So Tuesday, 14th of January, we've got psychology and customer experience, employee engagement and organizational structures. On the 15th, business cases and actionable measurement, emotional intelligence, memory and self-awareness. On the 16th is customer journey mapping, plotting your own customer journey map. And then into March, you've got reflecting on learning experiences on the 4th and the voice of the customer program on the 5th.
Yeah. So excellent. We look forward to seeing you again then, Richard.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, great.
This has been a different kind of show for me, because normally I'm very much the host and leading the conversation and trying to navigate it where I think it needs to go to bring out the best from the conversation. But I couldn't play that role today, because not only is it not my area of expertise, but it's not something that's particularly been close to me. I've become closer to it as a result of the work that I've done with Sandra over the last 5 or 6 months, filming a few of her sessions. But this has just been it's been fascinating for me. And we've got a comment from Neil, who, again, from completely away from this subject and sector, comes from event management world. So great stuff. Really enjoyed this, guys. So Neil, thank you very much for watching the bit that I know you have.
Thank you.
That's kind of the reaction that we want to get from people when we do these shows. It's to perhaps provide some value to people that are already in and around this world, but equally to perhaps educate those that aren't, and myself being one of them.
This stuff exists, and I really think that if more people can grasp it, they're going to make their lives so much easier. So I'm really grateful for your time, Richard. And
I enjoyed it.
Really look forward to reading that book, and I'm going to get through the rest of the books that I've got on to read next.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. No, I really enjoyed it. It's been great.
Richard, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to let you go. Sandra, I'm going to keep you just for 1 second. Richard, thanks for joining. And we'll put all the links to your book and stuff in this and make sure that it gets shared out later. We are going to share a version of these slides too, just so that people have a reference to come back to. And if you want to make any comments in the comments below, whether you're watching this now or later, then please do. And myself, Sandra, or Richard, or all three of us will make a comment as we see necessary. Richard, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you again very soon.
Will do. Thanks.
Sandra, show 2 done.
What an incredible guy. I mean, I just hope that people will even just take one action from the stuff that Richard's talking about, because I think, and I totally understand the point about science, I do think that puts a lot of people off. But interestingly, I think as we become more used to that kind of language, AI, machine learning, blah, 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 humans' role as our species in what is going on, I think now is the time. So it's super exciting to have him on this show now. And I think that coupled with the speakers that will come on in the next few weeks, it's a real mix of really heady stuff. And I'm hoping it will be adding value to people's lives.
Of course, it's going to add value to people's lives. And for those that are just kind of coming in at the end of this, we had a technical issue right at the beginning. I will make sure, because we are recording it as well, and we'll put that out on my YouTube channel, and Sandra can share the link out, but we'll make sure that we cut that technical issue off at the beginning. But I think it's really important that people come back and they engage with it and they watch it, because it's of huge value. Like I said just now, whether you are from within the sector and within this world or not, as I am.
Yeah, and I think, I do believe, from what I've heard of the book that Richard's publishing in February, it's going to be an easier one to digest than some of the ones I've been trawling through. And I think also it's possible that the roles within organizations may start to change in time. You know, marketeers obviously have a fundamentally important role, but their ability to adopt some of this behavioral science, to understand, to communicate it, to interpret it, is going to be something that's online. It's going to happen soon.
But actually therein lies perhaps one of the challenges and one of the problems with everything like this, and any form of science, I guess, is the terminology and the jargon that's used. And actually, one of the reasons, in my mind, it would make sense that people don't adopt it is because they probably don't understand it. But when you take a step back and you write things in English or in a language generally that people can understand, it makes it far easier for you to then say, okay, well, that now makes sense to me. Now I can apply that to my business in this way.
Yeah.
And I'd be really interested to look at some of the differences in the books that you've referred to in this and in last week's show, just to see the difference in terminology and how people talk about this subject, because you're going to see examples where people go very, very sciencey because they're writing for the scientists that are going to be reading the book. But actually, the ones that are likely to make more of a difference surely have got to be the ones that people understand.
Yeah, and just thinking about peak end rule just for a second, how we're describing it on this call, it really isn't rocket science. It really isn't.
No, but peak end rule is a really good example. It's something that I'd never heard of, and if you had said that term, and I've heard you say it in the things that we filmed, and it's not made sense to me. I understand it now because you put it into context, and you can say, well, okay, well, that makes perfect sense. I totally get it.
That's it. But I think where potentially customer experience professionals can do with having this knowledge is, rather than say, I really think we should, and they wouldn't say this, but I'd much rather we'll do some recovery stuff, right? We really need to invest in this. Well, give me your business case. Well, here's the business case. And by the way, this Nobel winner proved that this is the case. So let me watch this TED talk. Listen to what he's saying. It's proven scientifically, which, as we know, reduces the risk. So just having some of these theories in their back pockets, which is what they'll get from the course, means that it's a different conversation. It isn't about doing the nice to have or the soft stuff. This stuff is going to make businesses more money. It's going to make their employees happier. It's going to make their customers stick. And let's face it, that's what we're all about, right?
Absolutely. Right. We've got to wrap it up there, Sandra. I know you needed to go. Thank you very much for sticking around. You needed to go a while ago. I think we are at a point that I can say goodbye to you. I will wrap up the show because I know you have to leave, but thank you very much once again for being here and for organising this show. We are back next week. Actually, I'll let you go and then I'll talk about it next week. I'll talk about it when you've gone. So we'll say goodbye and thank you, Sandra.
Cheers then. Bye.
Bye-bye. So there we go, episode 2 done and dusted. We will be back on Thursday the 14th. That's this time next week, Thursday the 14th at 12 p.m. I've just noticed while we've been doing this that the kind of viewer numbers have increased, perhaps as we headed more in towards lunchtime. So I'll talk to Sandra and see if we want to just perhaps shift it maybe a half an hour back, just so that we can get a maximum number of people watching. We've loved seeing the little bit of interaction that we've had here. The conversation has been invaluable. Next week, joining myself and Sandra is Adrian Swinsko, an advisor on specific service experience, engagement issues. He's a mentor, thought leader, and runs masterclasses, and is the author of CX Punk and How to Wow. And yes, I did read that. And he's also a bit of a podcast master. We will be back at Thursday 14th at 12 o'clock. I'm going to play you out with a little promo for my own business, which is Streeem, the UK's first iPhone-only multi-camera live stream and event video production company. We very much look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much for joining. Goodbye. Hi, I'm Dominic. I run Streeem. We're the UK's first iPhone-only multi-camera live stream and event video production company. Rather than just talk about what we do, I thought I'd show you as well. First though, we need to pack this. Let's go. Everything I'm trying to build with Streeem comes down to one thing: efficiency. That efficiency comes in a variety of forms. From a kit perspective, we're more efficient. We've minimised the equipment we carry, and we can get everything we need for a 4 or 5 camera shoot into one small hand luggage case. From a time perspective, we're more efficient. The fact the kit is so small and everything is wireless makes us blisteringly quick to get set up. From a team perspective, we're more efficient. All our cameras can be mounted on remote controlled gimbals, so we don't need any more than 2 people on most jobs we do. From a cost perspective, we're more efficient. The minimised kit, the ease of transport, the speed of setup, the fact that everything is shot and edited live and that we don't charge per camera channel, all of that makes us a more cost-efficient option. And from a delivery perspective, we're more efficient. Everything is shot and edited live. You know, we can deliver recorded content in as little as 30 minutes, which breaks new boundaries in event and corporate video production. We're the first company in the UK to be using technology in this way to disrupt the video production world. And I love that me and my team at Streeem are spearheading that.